It began, as so many nightmares do, with a sound, a low, distant hum, growing, deepening, until the very air seemed to tremble. For those who lived through it, the sound of engines in the night would forever mean one thing: the bombers were coming. Between 1940 and 1941, Britain faced a storm unlike anything in its history. The Blitz, a German campaign of relentless bombing, turned once familiar streets into smoking ruins. But behind the headlines of Churchill's defiance and the RAF's courage lay another story. The story of ordinary men, women, and children caught in the firestorm. This is their story, the forgotten civilians of the Blitz. London, September 1940. The war had already taken its toll. Young men gone to fight, families fractured by fear. And yet, life carried on. Children went to school, mothers queued for rations. Theatres even reopened, as if to defy the gathering darkness. Then came that first night, Saturday, September 7th. The sirens began at 4:43 p.m. Within minutes, the city's sky was crawling with over 300 German bombers, escorted by hundreds more fighters. Their target, London's heart. For 8 hours, the Luftwaffe pounded the city. Docklands, the East End, Woolwich, entire streets vanished under fire and rubble. The smell of burning oil and timber hung over the Thames like a funeral shroud. A woman named Elsie Holloway, a mother of 2 from Bermondsey, later wrote in her diary, "The house shook as if a giant had gripped it by the shoulders. My youngest screamed for me, and I didn't know where to run. There was nowhere safe. Thousands like her fled into the underground, the tube transforming stations into makeshift shelters." Families huddled together beneath the city, children clutching gas masks shaped like cartoon animals. Some sang songs to keep the fear away. Others just waited, counting the seconds between explosions. When dawn broke, London was still burning. More than 400 people were dead, and the Blitz had only just begun. Night after night, the raids continued. By day, people cleared debris, patched walls, searched for loved ones. By night, they listened, waiting for the next siren. Children learned to identify the sound of enemy aircraft from miles away. Women became wardens, fire watchers, nurses. Elderly men volunteered as messengers or stretcher bearers. Everyone, in one way or another, became part of the war. In the BBC broadcast, one Londoner said with quiet pride, "We've grown used to the bombs. When the sirens wail, we finish our tea first." It was British stoicism at its best and its saddest. For behind that brave humour were thousands of silent tragedies. Historians often speak of the Blitz spirit, the courage, the unity, the stiff upper lip. But what's really told is the psychological toll. Children who wet their beds for years, mothers who couldn't bear to close their eyes at night, elderly couples who sat together, hands clasped, waiting for whatever would come. A teacher in the East End recalled finding one of her pupils, a boy of 9, trembling under his desk hours after the all clear. When she asked why, he whispered, "The siren might have lied." That single sentence captures the trauma that statistics can't. And yet, amidst the ruin, life persisted. On streets reduced to rubble, milkmen still made their rounds. Florists reopened. Children played hopscotch on broken pavements. Weddings were held in bombed-out churches. The bride's dress streaked with soot. The people refused to vanish. The photographer Bill Brandt captured an image in 1941. A young girl sitting calmly amid the remains of her home, clutching a doll. Her gaze steady, defiant, became a symbol of a city that would not bow. Prime Minister Winston Churchill addressed the nation after one of the worst nights. "This is not the end of London. This is the time when London will write her greatest story." His words became a lifeline. And for millions tuning in on crackling radios, they offered a fragile comfort to the idea that their suffering had meaning, that endurance itself was victory. Still, for every family who survived, there was another that did not. Hospitals overflowed. Rescue workers dug with bare hands. And through it all, the bombers kept coming. By May 1941, the Blitz had killed over 43,000 civilians and injured nearly 140,000. Entire districts, Coventry, Liverpool, Plymouth, were flattened. Yet production in British factories increased. The morale somehow held. But make no mistake, the scars were deep. The Blitz may have united a nation, but it also haunted it. The trauma lingered in silence in the nights when old veterans woke gasping, hearing sirens that no longer existed. As the war raged on, other cities would share London's fate. Coventry, Bath, Belfast, each would know the terror of fire raining from the sky. And behind every statistic, there was a story, a mother's cry, a child's loss, a neighbour's act of quiet heroism. In the next chapter, we'll journey to Coventry, the city that was erased in one night and reborn from its ashes. If this story moved you, remember history isn't just about battles and leaders. It's about the people who endured the unimaginable. Subscribe for the next part of the Forgotten Blitz, where we uncover the night Coventry burned and how its people refused to disappear. November 14th, 1940. A cold wind swept across the English Midlands. In Coventry, a small industrial city of 230,000 souls, the streets were quiet, blackout curtains drawn, church bells silent. The night eerily still. Few could imagine that within hours, their city would cease to exist. Coventry had become a symbol of wartime resilience, a proud hub of British engineering, home to car and munitions factories that powered the war effort. By day, workers labored tirelessly. By night, they sang in pubs, holding on to small joys as the war closed in around them. The Luftwaffe had bombed the city before, but only lightly. People believed that Coventry's size and its cathedral might spare it from the fate of London, but far away in occupied France, Luftwaffe bombers were already preparing. Operation Moonlight Sonata, a code name for one of the most destructive air raids in history. Their target, Coventry. At 7:10 p.m., the first sirens wailed. Families rushed to shelters, the basements of homes, the newly built Anderson shelters in gardens, or the city's few public bunkers. Moments later, the sky lit up in a blaze of magnesium flares. German Pathfinder aircraft marked the city center with eerie white lights like ghostly lanterns guiding death itself. Then came the bombers. Over 500 aircraft, wave after wave, each carrying a deadly cargo of high explosives and incendiaries. Within minutes, Coventry was on fire. The first explosions shattered windows across the city. Then, the flames began to spread, leaping from factory roofs to terraced houses, from churches to cinemas. The old timbered streets burned fast and hot. Those who escaped their shelters found themselves surrounded by fire. A survivor, Harold Maynard, later recalled, "It wasn't like the movies. The sky was red and black, like the end of the world. We tried to reach my mother's house, but the heat drove us back. The roads were melting as firefighters and volunteers battled the inferno. Water mains burst. Hoses went dry. The fire spread unchecked. By midnight, the city center was an ocean of flame. Standing on a hill above the city was St. Michael's Cathedral, one of the largest medieval churches in England. For centuries, it had been the heart of Coventry weddings, baptisms, funerals, all under its grand stone arches. At 11:30 p.m. It took a direct hit. Witnesses described the roof collapsing in a roar, sparks and ash raining down like snow. By morning, only the tower and outer walls remained. The next day, a message appeared scrawled on one of its surviving stones. "Father, forgive." Those two words became Coventry's eternal epitaph, not for vengeance, but for remembrance. Throughout the night, thousands sought refuge in makeshift shelters. Some sang hymns to drown the noise. Others simply prayed. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded. Doctors operated by candlelight, their hands shaking from exhaustion. A nurse later wrote, "We stopped counting the dead after dawn. There were too many." When the all clear finally sounded at 6:15 a.m., Coventry was unrecognizable. Entire districts had vanished. Out of 75,000 buildings, more than 43,000 were damaged or destroyed. Over 550 people were dead, 865 seriously injured, and tens of thousands left homeless. The morning light revealed a wasteland, twisted metal, blackened ruins, and silence. At first, the survivors could hardly speak. They wandered the streets in disbelief, searching for familiar landmarks. One woman recalled finding the ruins of her shop, the family bakery. Amid the rubble, she discovered a single unbroken loaf of bread, still warm from the oven. She took it home and shared it with neighbors, a small act of grace amid devastation. Reporters who arrived later struggled to find words. A BBC correspondent simply said, "Coventry has been finished," but he was wrong. Coventry wasn't finished, it was reborn. In the days that followed, the government feared morale would collapse. Instead, something extraordinary happened. Factories resumed production within 48 hours. Men and women, still covered in soot, went back to their machines. Church services were held among the ruins, and when King WWII visited, the people greeted him not with tears, but with determination. A local blacksmith told the king, "We'll build it all again, Your Majesty." Better than before, his words became prophecy. Coventry would later become a global symbol of peace and reconciliation, twinned with the German city of Dresden, once its enemy, now its friend. Coventry's suffering was immense, its destruction deliberate, its loss incalculable. Yet its legacy endures in silence, in the soot-stained stones of the old cathedral that still stand today beside the new one. Visitors often pause there, reading the inscription, "Father forgive," not "Father forgive them," but "Father forgive," a plea that includes all humanity. Because war spares no one, not the pilot above, not the mother below, not the child who wakes to find his world gone. Coventry's ashes remind us that courage isn't always found on battlefields. Sometimes it lives in the quiet resolve of those who survive. The Blitz was more than London and Coventry. Across Britain, cities like Liverpool, Plymouth, and Belfast faced the same nightly terror. The same fires, the same losses. In the next part, we journey north to Liverpool, Britain's vital port and lifeline, where families braved some of the worst bombing raids of the war. Their endurance kept a nation fed, armed, and hopeful. If you're moved by Coventry's story, remember to keep these voices alive. Subscribe for Part 3, Liverpool Under Siege, where the bombs fell on the docks and the people refused to surrender. Because the story of the Blitz isn't just about destruction, it's about humanity's unbreakable will to endure. If London was Britain's heart during the Blitz, then Liverpool was its lifeblood. From its docks came the ships that carried food, weapons, and hope across the Atlantic. But in the spring of 1941, that lifeline nearly broke. Liverpool and its neighbour, Bootle, endured some of the heaviest bombing outside London, a campaign so ferocious that the city would later be described as the most bombed in Britain, after the capital itself. Yet for the people of Liverpool, courage was as common as hardship and humour their only armour. By 1941, Liverpool had become Britain's main Atlantic port. Every week, convoys arrived with food, fuel, and war supplies, vital cargo in a nation fighting for survival. The Germans knew it. To cripple Britain, they had to strike its ports. And so, they came for Liverpool. The city had faced earlier raids, but nothing like what was to come. The May Blitz of 1941. A week-long onslaught that would test the soul of a city. On May 1st, 1941, as dusk fell, the familiar wail of sirens filled the air. People hurried into shelters, some to the basements of their terraced homes, others to the underground shelters hastily built beneath the docks. Then came the thunder. Over 600 German aircraft descended upon Merseyside. The docks, all depots, and railways were their main targets, but in total war, there are no boundaries. Bombs rained over the city centre, over homes, over hospitals. Firefighters raced from blaze to blaze. They were exhausted, under-equipped, and often fighting without water as mains burst from the impact of high explosives. A local warden later said, "It was like trying to fight a volcano with a bucket." On the second night, a direct hit struck Durning Road shelter, one of the largest in Liverpool. Hundreds had taken refuge inside. When a £1 bomb penetrated the building, the shelter collapsed. Flames and smoke filled the tunnels, trapping those within. Rescuers worked through the night, but few survived. A mother who escaped said later, "All I remember is the sound not of the bomb, but of people screaming in the dark. It never left me." More than 160 people died in that single tragedy, a grim reminder that even the places meant to protect could become tombs. To the children of Liverpool, the Blitz was a strange, shifting nightmare, part fear, part routine. They played in the rubble after air raids, collecting bits of shrapnel as souvenirs. They built toy ships from the splinters of bombed docks. But at night, their laughter faded into tears as sirens wailed again. Many had already been evacuated to the countryside. Yet thousands remained, families too poor or unwilling to send their children away. For them, the city's shelters became second homes. One child wrote years later, "We used to sleep with our coats on. Not because of the cold, because you never knew when you'd have to run." On May 3rd, the air raid reached its most terrifying crescendo. Bombers struck the city centre repeatedly. Flames rose so high they could be seen from across the Irish Sea. Among the destruction stood St. Luke's Church, known today as the bombed-out church, hit by incendiaries. It burned through the night, its stained glass melting in the heat. By dawn, only its shell remained, a silent monument to the faith that survived when the walls did not. To this day, Its empty windows look out over the city, a reminder of those who never came home. The raids continued for 7 consecutive nights. Bootle, Birkenhead, Wallasey all were hit. The docks became seas of fire. At one point, so many warehouses burned that the entire Mersey waterfront glowed like molten metal. Emergency services were overwhelmed. Ambulances ran without sirens, not to hide from bombers, but because there were simply too many calls. Doctors operated in cellars, often by candlelight. Civilians dug survivors from rubble with bare hands. By the end of that week, over 2,500 people were dead, 1,000 seriously injured, and nearly half the homes in the city damaged or destroyed. Then still, the ship sailed. Despite the devastation, the port of Liverpool never stopped working. Within hours of each raid, dockworkers, many of them older men and women, were back at their posts. They unloaded supplies, repaired cranes, and cleared wreckage, often under the threat of more attacks. One naval officer remarked, "The dockers of Liverpool deserve a medal." Without them, Britain would starve, even when food ran short, even when sleep was impossible. The people kept the port alive. They knew that if Liverpool fell, the nation would suffer with it. In the face of terror, Liverpudlians found refuge in laughter. Comedians performed in bomb shelters. Neighbors shared jokes about Hitler's aim. Children painted, "Welcome, Jerry," on sandbags outside their homes. That humor, that fierce refusal to break, became the essence of what Britain later called the Blitz spirit. But for Liverpool, it was more than spirit. It was survival. A local newspaper headline summed it up perfectly. "Liverpool still laughs." It wasn't defiance for the cameras, it was the heartbeat of a battered, unbowed city. When the raids finally ended in May 1941, Liverpool was scarred but undefeated. Over 4,000 civilians had died, but the docks remained open. Ships still sailed, and life somehow went on. The same courage echoed across Britain's coastal towns, from Plymouth to Portsmouth, from Belfast to Glasgow. In the next part, we'll travel south to Plymouth, where a proud naval city faced destruction night after night and found rebirth through unity. If Liverpool's story inspired you, remember to keep their voices alive. Subscribe for Part 4, Plymouth, the naval city in flames, as we continue uncovering the forgotten civilian stories of the Blitz, the courage, the fear, and the humanity that refused to die. On England's southwest coast lies the proud naval city of Plymouth, a place built around the sea. Its people tied for generations to the Royal Navy and the dockyards that armed it. By 1941, Plymouth had already seen hardship, but nothing could prepare its citizens for the inferno that was about to descend. The Germans called it Operation Monschenschnut 2 Moonlight Sonata. Part 2. For the people of Plymouth, it was simply the week the sky never went dark. As the war deepened, Plymouth became one of Britain's most critical naval bases. Its docks repaired warships, its factories produced munitions, and its harbour sheltered convoys bound for the Atlantic. To the Luftwaffe, it was a prime military target. To its people, it was home. The first major raid came in March 1941. The sirens sounded at p.m., and before midnight, the sky above the Hoe and the dockyards blazed white with flares. Searchlights' creases crossed frantically, tracing the silver bellies of bombers overhead. Then came the explosions, rolling thunder that seemed to shake the sea itself. The bombing lasted for hours. Incendiaries rained on the city like a storm of fireflies, turning rooftops into pyres. Houses collapsed in showers of sparks. Entire streets vanished in seconds. Firefighters, many barely trained, formed human chains with buckets when hoses failed. Sailors from the nearby dockyards joined them, racing through burning debris to pull survivors from wreckage. A warden, Frank Bennett, later recalled, "It was like the end of the world. The heat was so fierce, the tarmac bubbled. We could hear the bombs whistling down and prayed the next one wasn't ours." By dawn, Plymouth was unrecognizable, a smoking skeleton of its former self. Among those caught in the flames were the city's women and children. The schools had long been evacuated, yet many mothers refused to leave, unwilling to abandon husbands or elderly parents. In one shelter beneath Charles Street, dozens of families huddled together. When a bomb struck nearby, dust filled the chamber, choking the air. A mother later remembered clutching her baby as the lights went out. "I couldn't see her face, only feel her tiny breath. I thought it was the last thing I'd ever feel," she survived. Many did not. That same night, St. Andrew's Church, Plymouth's oldest parish, took a direct hit. Its great stained glass windows shattered, its roof collapsed. and the ancient bells crashed to the floor when dawn came. The words resurgam, Latin for "I shall rise again," were chalked onto its charred doorway by an unknown hand. Those words became Plymouth's motto, etched into the city's heart forever. Only weeks later, the bombers returned. The April 1941 raids were even worse. Over 2 consecutive nights, more than 4,000 incendiaries and 240 tons of high explosives rained down. The center of Plymouth was obliterated. Entire rows of Georgian houses vanished. Hospitals, cinemas, schools all gone. Rescue crews worked by the light of burning buildings, guided only by the roar of collapsing roofs. When water ran out, they used sand, earth, even beer from shattered barrels to smother flames. By the time the all clear sounded, over 1,000 people were dead and nearly 20,000 homes destroyed. Photographs from the morning after show a ghost city. Streets buried under ash, trams frozen mid-journey, chimneys standing like tombstones. Yet amid the wreckage, life stirred. Milkmen resumed their rounds within days. Market traders sold vegetables from carts balanced on rubble. Children helped clear bricks from the pavements, turning it into a kind of game. A BBC correspondent visiting soon after reported, "Plymouth is wounded but unbroken. Its people smile through the smoke." Despite the devastation, the dockyards kept working. Within 24 hours, repair crews were back on duty, patching hulls, fitting weapons, sending ships to sea. For the sailors, Plymouth was more than a base, it was a promise that Britain still stood. The spirit of resurgam became more than a word. It became a way of life. Even those who had lost everything volunteered for the Home Guard, the Women's Voluntary Service, or the rescue parties. They built air raid shelters from the rubble of their own homes. They planted gardens where bombs had fallen. They kept going. After the war, Plymouth faced the immense task of rebuilding. Architect Patrick Abercrombie drew up a visionary plan, a modern city. Wide boulevards replacing the tangled medieval lanes that had burned. Some lamented the loss of the old streets, but most saw it as healing. A chance to start anew. St. Andrew's Church was restored, and above its great west door, the single word remains carved in stone: Resurgam, I shall rise again, and Plymouth did. The story of Plymouth echoes across every British port that burned during those dark years. Courage, loss, and the stubborn will to rebuild. Yet not all who suffered lived by the sea. In the countryside and small towns, the Blitz brought different horrors: isolation, sudden tragedy, and grief that reached far from the front lines. In the next part, we journey north to Belfast, where one devastating raid shattered the illusion that distance meant safety, and where resilience was born amid ruin. If Plymouth's story moved you, help keep these memories alive. Subscribe for Part 5 Belfast, Fire over the Harbour, as we continue our journey through the forgotten civilian stories of the Blitz, ordinary people who faced the fire and rose again. In the spring of 1941, the people of Belfast still believed they were safe. The war, though close in spirit, seemed far away. The Luftwaffe had struck London, Coventry, Liverpool, Plymouth, but surely not Northern Ireland. Surely not this quiet city across the Irish Sea. They were wrong. In April 1941, the bombs came and Belfast would awaken to a nightmare unlike anything in its history. At the start of the war, Belfast was a city of factories and shipyards, proud and industrious. It had built the RMS Titanic a generation earlier, and now its yards produced ships and aircraft for the war effort. Yet the government in London considered it a low-priority target. Air defences were minimal, only a handful of anti-aircraft guns and limited searchlights guarded the city. Even the shelters were inadequate. Most civilians relied on sandbags, basements, or simply prayed. Still, life carried on. People attended dances, went to church, listened to the radio, and told themselves the Luftwaffe would never come this far. They would learn, in one terrible night, how wrong they were. On the night of April 15, 1941, the first warning sirens sounded just after 10 o'clock. Few took them seriously. Some even stayed in their beds, believing it was another false alarm. Minutes later, the sky erupted. Over 200 German bombers appeared over the city, guided by moonlight and the shimmer of the River Lagan. Their target, the docks, the shipyards, and the industrial heart of Belfast. But once again, civilians paid the highest price. For 5 relentless hours, bombs fell across the city. Factories, homes, and churches were obliterated. Whole streets vanished in firestorms. A survivor, Margaret McElroy, recalled, The ground shook as if the earth itself was crying. We could see the river glowing red, and the smell, I'll never forget it. It wasn't smoke. It was burning people. The city's defenses were woefully unprepared. Out of more than 100 guns promised by the government, only 26 were in operation. They fired until their barrels glowed red. But the bombers came in waves too large to stop. The Luftwaffe dropped over 200 tons of high explosives and tens of thousands of incendiaries. Hospitals were hit. The water mains were shattered. And as fire spread, there was nothing left to fight them with. When the all clear sounded at dawn, the destruction was beyond comprehension. By sunrise, Belfast lay silent under a pall of smoke. Corpses lined the pavements. Trams stood derailed in the streets. A thick haze of dust and ash coated everything from the docks to the cathedral quarter. Entire families were gone. Rows of terraced houses had collapsed into craters. In one district alone, New Lodge, more than 150 people were killed when a single bomb struck a shelter. Doctors and nurses worked without rest. Priests moved through the ruins, giving last rites by candlelight. One clergyman later wrote, "We carried the dead in carts, in wheelbarrows, whatever we could find. There were too many coffins. Over 900 civilians died that night." It was the greatest single loss of life in Northern Ireland's history. As dawn broke, the survivors looked for help, but it wasn't coming fast enough. Roads were blocked. Telegraph lines were down. The government had underestimated the attack so completely that no emergency plan existed. It was the Republic of Ireland neutral in the war that responded first. Within hours, fire crews and ambulances crossed the border from Dublin, Dundalk, and Drogheda to help their northern neighbours. One Irish firefighter recalled, "We didn't see sights that night, only people who needed help. It was a moment of humanity that transcended politics." Faith and nationhood. Amid the chaos, Belfast churches became places of refuge and mourning. In St. Patrick's Church, families crowded together in prayer as bombs fell nearby. The priest later found his altar buried under debris, but the crucifix still standing amid the dust. The bells of the city fell silent, some because their towers were destroyed, others out of mourning. For weeks, they would not ring again, and yet, amid the silence, Belfast's people refused to give in. They cleared streets, shared food, and helped the homeless find shelter. Even in despair, community became their shield. Barely 3 weeks later, on May 4th, the Luftwaffe returned. The second raid, known as the Fire Raid, struck the city again, focusing on the docks and industrial areas. Flames spread across the shipyards and into working-class neighborhoods. The city, still recovering from the first attack, had little left to fight back with, though smaller in scale. The second raid finished what the first had started, destroying much of Belfast's industrial base and leaving thousands more homeless. By the time the bombers departed, more than 1,300 civilians had been killed in total, and 100,000 people, nearly half the city's population, were left without homes. But out of the ashes, Belfast's strength emerged. The city's factories resumed production within weeks. Workers, still mourning loved ones, repaired ships and built planes. Women volunteered in soup kitchens and hospitals. Children carried messages for rescue crews, often through streets that no longer had names. A BBC reporter visiting the city described it as a place of ruin and resolve of people beaten, but never broken. That resolve would carry Belfast through the rest of the war and long after it ended. Its scars would remain, not just on the streets, but in the hearts of those who had survived. Belfast's suffering was a warning that no place, however distant, was truly safe. The Blitz had stretched its reach across Britain and beyond, sparing no one, not even the innocent. But as the bombs fell, another battle was being fought, not for land or ships, but for the human mind. The psychological toll of living under the sirens was immense. Fear, exhaustion, and trauma took their own quiet casualties. In the next part, we'll explore the silent wounds, the mental and emotional cost of the Blitz, and how civilians endured the invisible scars that lasted long after the fires went out. If Belfast's story moved you, take a moment to reflect not only on the destruction, but on the compassion that rose from it. Subscribe for Part 6, The Silent Wounds, the psychological toll of the Blitz, where we uncover the hidden trauma carried by those who survived the longest nights of the war. The bombs eventually stopped falling, but silence didn't mean peace. When the sirens went quiet and the fires died down, a different battle began, a battle fought in the minds and hearts of those who survived. The Blitz was not just a campaign of destruction, It was psychological warfare night after night, designed to break morale, to make ordinary people lose faith in survival itself. And while history remembers the courage of the British people, few speak of the invisible scars they carried long after the war ended. Every night, the same ritual. The siren's cry, the rush to the shelter, the waiting. In the darkness, people clutched one another, mothers to children, strangers to strangers. The air was thick with fear, cigarette smoke, and whispered prayers. Children learned to tell the difference between sounds: the hum of distant planes, the whistle of falling bombs, the thud that meant you were still alive. Psychologists later found that many children grew up with what we now call anticipatory anxiety, a constant readiness for danger. The war taught them to listen for death, even in peace. That habit never left. For the adults, the fear was more complex. Many lived with what doctors then called nerves or war strain. They didn't have the language we use today: post-traumatic stress, survivor's guilt, depression. Instead, they called it shell shock, a phrase borrowed from soldiers in the trenches of the First World War. But this time, it wasn't soldiers who trembled. It was civilians, mothers, widows, bus drivers, nurses, people who had endured months of bombardment with nowhere to run. A woman from London recalled, "I used to wake up in the night and listen for the sirens. Even when there weren't any, I could still hear them in my head." The mind, it seemed, had learned the sound of fear and couldn't forget it. The government's wartime propaganda spoke of the Blitz spirit: courage, cheerfulness, unity. And there was truth to that. People did keep going. They joked, they sang, they helped each other through the worst nights of their lives. But beneath that surface, many were quietly breaking. Doctors noted a surge in insomnia, panic attacks, and what they called night terrors. Some civilians became unable to sleep unless they were underground. Others refused to leave their shelters at all. A psychologist in 1942 wrote, "The British are praised for their resilience. What we fail to see is that resilience has its own casualties." For the children, the Blitz became a lesson in endurance far too early. They drew pictures of planes and fires. They learned to dive for cover at the faintest noise. Many were evacuated, sent away from their families to the countryside. But separation brought its own kind of trauma. Thousands of children lived for years with strangers, never knowing if their parents were alive. Some came home to rubble to find the place they called home no longer existed. A teacher from Surrey remembered. The children who returned after the Blitz smiled less. They were polite, quiet, but their eyes were old. Those children would grow up in peacetime, but the war would never quite leave them. Grief became part of daily life. Every street had its dead. Every family had someone missing. But people didn't talk about it. The war demanded strength, not sorrow. In London, a woman named Elsie Thompson lost her husband and 2 children when their home collapsed. She never cried in public. When asked how she managed, she said quietly, "Everyone had lost someone. Who was I to complain?" For decades, people like Elsie lived in silence, their grief buried beneath the rubble of memory. It wasn't until the late 20th century that historians began to uncover their stories: the quiet endurance of civilians who had survived by not speaking at all. Wartime doctors struggled to understand what they were seeing. Men and women with trembling hands, sudden bursts of anger, uncontrollable tears. They called it air raid shock, but with limited resources and the pressure to keep morale high. Treatment was rare. Many sufferers were told to pull themselves together. Few had the luxury to rest. The war went on, and so did they. In hospitals, nurses learned to comfort the living as much as they treated the wounded. Some whispered prayers over patients who were physically unharmed, but mentally lost. One nurse wrote in her diary, "I have seen men come in without a scratch who cannot stop shaking. Their eyes look past me as if they've already seen the next raid." When the war finally ended in 1945, the air raid stopped, but the trauma didn't. Bomb sites became playgrounds for children, but the adults saw only ghosts. The smell of smoke, the rumble of thunder, even the wail of a passing train could bring the fear flooding back, and yet few sought help. Mental health in those days was not something one spoke of. The heroes of the home front were expected to smile and move on, but deep down, many never did. It would take generations and new science before the full impact of the Blitz on mental health was understood. Historians now call it one of the earliest examples of mass civilian trauma, a whole population learning to live with fear. The strength of those civilians was not the absence of fear, it was their ability to carry it and keep going. They comforted neighbors even when they had nothing left. They rebuilt homes while haunted by the ones they'd lost. They laughed in the dark because laughter was all they had left. The Blitz spirit was not just courage, it was survival, disguised as hope. And the wounds they carried in silence became the foundations of post-war Britain, a society shaped by endurance and empathy. The fires of the Blitz burned cities to ash, but the invisible fires, the ones inside people's minds, burned for years afterward. Even today, their diaries, their memories, their silences remind us of the cost of survival. In the next part, we turn from those who endured to those who rebuilt, the architects, the workers, and the ordinary citizens who turned ruins into rebirth. This is part 7, From Ashes to Dawn, Rebuilding the Blitz Cities. If you believe their courage deserves to be remembered, subscribe to WWII Nightmares for part 7, From Ashes to Dawn, because history isn't just about how we fight wars, it's about how we heal after them. When the last siren faded and the final bomb crater cooled, Britain faced a new kind of war, not against an enemy, but against devastation itself. Cities once proud and alive were now mazes of rubble. Church spires stood like broken bones. The air still smelled of soot and loss. Yet, in that silence, something remarkable began. From ashes rose the determination to rebuild not only the walls that had fallen, but the spirit of a nation that refused to stay buried. Across London, Coventry, Liverpool, Plymouth, the same sight greeted the dawn, streets that no longer existed. In London alone, more than 1 million buildings were damaged or destroyed. In Coventry, whole districts had vanished. Smoke still curled from what had been cathedrals and schools, but among the ruins, people appeared not soldiers, but civilians, men with shovels, women with buckets, children with wheelbarrows. They weren't waiting for orders, they simply began. A London fire warden recalled, "We had no machines, no money, just our hands and the will to make something live again." Before the architects and planners came, there were the rubble women, the unsung builders of Britain's rebirth. Armed with nothing but gloves and determination, they cleared debris brick by brick. They sorted shattered glass, dug through dust, salvaged what could be reused. It was dirty, backbreaking work, often unpaid, uncelebrated but vital. Every brick cleared was a statement. "We're still here." In Coventry, a volunteer named Grace Fielding described it simply. "We buried our dead, then we swept the street. It was the only way to keep living." No city symbolized rebirth more than Coventry. On the night of November 14, 1940, the Luftwaffe had destroyed its medieval heart in one raid, its cathedral reduced to an empty shell. Yet by the war's end, Coventry became a monument not to loss, but to reconciliation. When architects planned the new cathedral, they decided not to erase the ruins. Instead, they built a new structure beside the old. The shattered walls left open to the sky as a memorial, and inside the new building, behind the altar, they engraved a single word: forgive. Coventry would become a city of peace. Its rebirth a message to the world that forgiveness, not vengeance, was Britain's truest victory. London's reconstruction was another story, immense, complicated, and deeply human. The city was scarred in every direction. From St. Paul's to the East End, there were miles of destruction. Yet, remarkably, the people stayed. Families built makeshift homes in bomb sites. Shopkeepers reopened businesses in basements. Children played in the craters that had once been streets. The government launched what became known as the Great Rebuilding. Architects like Patrick Abercrombie envisioned a new, modern London, greener, safer, better planned. But progress was slow. Materials were scarce, budgets tighter still. And for many, the Blitz had changed not just the city, but their idea of what home meant. A survivor from Stepney said, "The walls could be replaced. The people couldn't. We built our homes again, but we never built the same life." The post-war years also saw a quiet revolution. Women who had filled wartime roles in factories, fire brigades, and civil defense refused to step back into silence. They became planners, engineers, and community organizers. In Birmingham, women's groups led local rebuilding projects, ensuring that new housing estates had playgrounds, schools, and clinics. They wanted more than just roofs. They wanted futures. One volunteer, Martha Hughes, wrote, "We had lost everything, so we decided to build a world where our daughters wouldn't have to." Their vision laid the foundations for Britain's social housing movement, a legacy that outlasted the ruins themselves. There was a strange beauty in the rebuilding, a shared belief that the worst had already passed, and the future could only improve. Artists painted murals on shattered walls. Poets wrote of rebirth and light. In London, choir sang again in St. Paul's Cathedral, its dome still bearing the scars of shrapnel. Even the smallest acts carried meaning. A single flower planted in the soil of a pond crater. A wedding held in a half-burned church. Children laughing in the ruins. Each was a quiet act of defiance, a promise that destruction would never have the last word. In time, the bomb sites became memorials. Some were turned into parks. Others became housing estates, hospitals, or libraries. Yet, throughout Britain, fragments of the old Blitz remain, bricks fused by fire, walls pitted by shrapnel. Shelters turned to museums, they stand as reminders not of was glory, but of endurance. Every scar tells a story of a mother who refused to flee, a child who survived the flames, a city that learned to stand again. One Londoner said at the reopening of his street, "We built again, not because we forgot, but because we remembered." Rebuilding after the Blitz wasn't only about restoring buildings, it was about reclaiming hope. The war had taught people the fragility of life and the strength of unity. They had endured terror, hunger, and grief, yet somehow found enough faith to imagine a better tomorrow from the rubble of war. Britain rebuilt a sense of purpose, one brick, one song, one sunrise at a time, and when dawn finally broke over the rebuilt cities, the world saw not a land defeated by bombs, but a people defined by resilience. The story of the Blitz ends not in fire, but in light, in the courage to rebuild, to forgive, to move forward. But even as new cities rose, the memories lingered. For those who had lived through the air raids, the echoes never truly faded. Each night, the distant sound of thunder still felt too much like falling bombs. In our final part, we return to those echoes, to the survivors, now old, who still remember the sirens, the fear, and the fragile hope that carried them through. This is Part 8, Echoes of the Blitz, the survivors' voices. If you've journeyed this far through the ruins and rebirth of wartime Britain, subscribe and stay with us for the final chapter, Echoes of the Blitz. Hear the voices of those who lived through the fire and carried its memory across generations. Because remembrance is not just looking back, it's ensuring the world never forgets. A survivor from Stepney said, "The walls could be replaced. The people couldn't. We built our homes again, but we never built the same life." The post-war years also saw a quiet revolution. Women who had filled wartime roles in factories, fire brigades, and civil defense refused to step back into silence. They became planners, engineers, and community organizers. In Birmingham, women's groups led local rebuilding projects, ensuring that new housing estates had playgrounds, schools, and clinics. They wanted more than just roofs. They wanted futures. One volunteer, Martha Hughes, wrote, "We had lost everything, so we decided to build a world where our daughters wouldn't have to." Their vision laid the foundations for Britain's social housing movement, a legacy that outlasted the ruins themselves. There was a strange beauty in the rebuilding, a shared belief that the worst had already passed, and the future could only improve. Artists painted murals on shattered walls. Poets wrote of rebirth and light. In London, choir sang again in St. Paul's Cathedral, its dome still bearing the scars of shrapnel. Even the smallest acts carried meaning. A single flower planted in the soil of a pond crater. A wedding held in a half-burned church. Children laughing in the ruins. Each was a quiet act of defiance, a promise that destruction would never have the last word. In time, the bomb sites became memorials. Some were turned into parks. Others became housing estates, hospitals, or libraries. Yet, throughout Britain, fragments of the old Blitz remain, bricks fused by fire, walls pitted by shrapnel. Shelters turned to museums, they stand as reminders not of was glory, but of endurance. Every scar tells a story of a mother who refused to flee, a child who survived the flames, a city that learned to stand again. One Londoner said at the reopening of his street, "We built again, not because we forgot, but because we remembered." Rebuilding after the Blitz wasn't only about restoring buildings, it was about reclaiming hope. The war had taught people the fragility of life and the strength of unity. They had endured terror, hunger, and grief, yet somehow found enough faith to imagine a better tomorrow from the rubble of war. Britain rebuilt a sense of purpose, one brick, one song, one sunrise at a time, and when dawn finally broke over the rebuilt cities, the world saw not a land defeated by bombs, but a people defined by resilience. The story of the Blitz ends not in fire, but in light in the courage to rebuild, to forgive, to move forward. But even as new cities rose, the memories lingered. For those who had lived through the air raids, the echoes never truly faded. Each night, the distant sound of thunder still felt too much like falling bombs. In our final part, we return to those echoes, to the survivors, now old, who still remember the sirens, the fear, and the fragile hope that carried them through. This is Part 8, Echoes of the Blitz, the survivors' voices. If you've journeyed this far through the ruins and rebirth of wartime Britain, subscribe and stay with us for the final chapter, Echoes of the Blitz. Hear the voices of those who lived through the fire and carried its memory across generations. Because remembrance is not just looking back, it's ensuring the world never forgets.